They weren't coming from the outside because they were already inside. And that is what turns the Cold War from a familiar conflict between two superpowers into something far more unsettling and almost invisible, because it wasn't only about missiles, armies, and politics, but about people who lived among ordinary citizens, who worked, smiled, went to stores, built families, and at the same time could have been part of a hidden network prepared for the worst possible scenario. And this system didn't appear by accident. It was built over many years as part of a carefully designed strategy in which the Soviet Union relied not only on military power but also on the ability to act quietly from within, in places where no one expected a threat, because in a potential war, the element of surprise could become decisive. And that is why a special category of agents was created, known as illegals, people without official status, without diplomatic cover, completely removed from their previous lives and placed into a new, artificially constructed reality, where every detail, from their name to their entire biography, was part of a legend prepared long before they were sent. The preparation of these agents took years and included not only learning the language but deeply understanding the culture, behavior, habits, and even the way people think in the country they were being sent to. Because even a small mistake could lead to exposure, and that is why they were trained not just to speak without an accent, but to think like native speakers, to react like locals, to understand context, humor, and social norms. And all of this was combined with intense psychological training, because these individuals were expected to live double lives, sometimes for decades, without the ability to openly talk about their past, without the right to make mistakes, and constantly under hidden pressure. And at the same time, their main task in the beginning was not to take action at all, but the opposite, to become completely invisible, to blend into society, to get jobs, build social connections, and create the impression of being completely ordinary people who were no different from anyone else. And that is exactly what made them so dangerous, because there was no way to distinguish them from millions of others. But the purpose of these agents was not limited to traditional intelligence work, because in the event of war, their role was expected to change dramatically. And this is where the story becomes truly disturbing, because according to various declassified materials and testimonies from former intelligence officers, there were plans in which such agents could be used for sabotage inside the enemy's territory. And this was not about random actions, but carefully selected targets that were critical to the functioning of the entire country, including energy systems, transportation hubs, and communication networks. And the idea was that at the moment a conflict began, the attack would come not only from the outside but also from within, disrupting the country's ability to coordinate and respond. Because if electricity goes out, transportation stops, and communication breaks down, even the most powerful nation becomes vulnerable. At the same time, an important part of this system were so-called hidden caches, which were created in advance and placed across Western countries, including the United States. And these caches could contain money, documents, equipment, and other resources needed to carry out operations, and such sites were actually discovered after the Cold War ended, which confirms that this was not just a theoretical concept, but a real preparation that had been taking place for many years. And the fact that these caches could exist undetected for such a long time shows how carefully everything was planned, and it also suggests that agents were expected to operate independently, without drawing attention and without relying on direct communication with their command. Because in wartime, communication lines could easily be disrupted. An even more unsettling aspect is the concept of sleeper agents, individuals who could live for years without carrying out any active operations, remaining in a state of waiting, and this made the entire system extremely difficult to detect, because these agents did nothing suspicious. They didn't regularly pass information. They didn't maintain obvious contact with others in the network, and they didn't leave traces that would attract attention from intelligence services. And only after receiving a signal would they move into action. And although the exact methods of delivering such signals were never fully revealed, it is known that different techniques were used, including radio transmissions and encrypted messages, as well as so-called number stations that broadcast sequences of numbers understood only by those who had the key. And this is where the story starts to become even more disturbing, because behind this system, there may have been something much larger that for a long time remained almost completely hidden. And as researchers began to study declassified documents and testimonies from former intelligence officers more closely, it became clear that this was not about a few isolated agents, but about an entire system designed for long-term hidden operations. And this is where the details start to become even more disturbing, because beyond placing people inside the United States, the Soviet Union was also preparing the infrastructure that would support their actions, including the creation of hidden caches placed across Western countries long before any possible conflict. And these caches could contain money, forged documents, communication devices, maps, instructions, and in some cases even equipment that could be used for sabotage. And the fact that such caches were actually discovered years later in both the United States and Europe confirms that this was not a theory, but a real and carefully executed plan. And the idea that these locations could remain hidden for years shows just how advanced and organized the entire system was. One of the most important features of this network was its independence, because in the event of war, direct communication with Moscow could be disrupted or completely cut off, and agents would have to operate on their own, relying on instructions they had received long before, which means that many scenarios were planned in advance, including which targets to strike, how to disable them, and how to act afterward without being detected. And among the most likely targets were critical parts of national infrastructure, such as power plants, electrical grids, transportation systems, bridges, railways, and communication networks, because damaging several of these at the same time could create a chain reaction, disrupting entire regions and making the situation extremely difficult to control. And the goal was not only physical damage, but the breakdown of order itself. What made these plans even more effective was the psychological impact they were designed to create. Because sabotage is not just about destruction. It is about confusion, fear, and loss of control. And when systems fail at the same time, people panic. Information becomes unreliable, and trust in authorities begins to collapse. And in that kind of environment, even small actions can have massive consequences. And this is why agents were trained not only in technical skills, but also in how to operate under pressure, how to avoid detection after completing a mission, and how to disappear without leaving any trace behind, becoming invisible once again after carrying out their task. At the same time, American intelligence agencies, especially the FBI, were not unaware of these threats. And throughout the Cold War, there were ongoing efforts to identify and track Soviet agents, and in some cases, these efforts led to major breakthroughs when it was discovered that individuals who had lived in the country for decades were actually connected to Soviet intelligence. And these cases revealed just how deeply such agents could integrate into society. But even with these successes, there was always the understanding that not all of them could be found, because the structure of the network was specifically designed to minimize contact between agents and prevent the exposure of the entire system through a single arrest, which meant that even if one person was discovered, others could remain completely hidden. Another layer of uncertainty comes from the fact that many details of these operations remain classified, or only partially revealed even today. And while some documents have been declassified over time, they provide only a limited picture of the full scale of preparation, leaving many unanswered questions, such as how many caches were actually created, how many agents were deployed, and what exact instructions they were given. And this lack of complete information makes the story even more unsettling, because it suggests that what we know might only be a small part of a much larger system that was never fully exposed. And as more fragments of this history slowly come to light, it becomes clear that this was not just intelligence work in the traditional sense, but a complex and coordinated system designed to be activated at a critical moment. And this leads to the most important and unsettling question. Because if all of this was real, if preparation continued for decades, and if parts of it are still unknown, then how close the world actually was to a scenario where a war would not begin with missiles crossing oceans, but with a chain of events unfolding inside the country itself. And that is exactly the point where the story becomes even more serious, because in the next part we move from plans and preparation to the moments when something very similar almost became reality. And this is where the story stops being just about plans, theories, and preparation, and starts getting dangerously close to reality. Because there were moments during the Cold War when the world stood on the edge, not only because of missiles or political decisions, but because systems failed, signals were misread, and the possibility of chaos from within was no longer just an idea. And one of the most unsettling aspects is that many of these incidents happened silently, without the public ever realizing how close things actually were to spiraling out of control. Because behind the scenes, intelligence agencies on both sides were constantly operating in a state of high alert, trying to detect threats that could come not only from across the ocean, but from within their own borders. There were real cases when individuals who had lived for years as ordinary citizens were suddenly exposed as part of foreign intelligence networks. And these revelations showed how deeply some operations had penetrated society because these people had jobs, families, social circles. And yet behind all of that, they were connected to something much larger, something that had been built over decades. And even though many of them were involved primarily in intelligence gathering, the existence of such networks made it clear that in a different situation, their role could have changed instantly, and the same structures used for collecting information could have been used for something far more destructive. And that possibility alone was enough to concern security agencies at the highest levels. At the same time, there were incidents involving hidden equipment and communication methods that reinforced the idea that preparations went beyond simple espionage. because when authorities discovered concealed transmitters, encrypted communication tools, or hidden caches containing operational materials, it became clear that these networks were designed to function even under extreme conditions. And some of these discoveries happened years after they had been placed, which means that for a long time, no one even knew they existed. And that raises a deeply unsettling thought. Because if some were found, how many were never discovered at all? Another layer of tension comes from the fact that during the Cold War, both sides were operating under constant pressure and fear of surprise attack, which meant that decision-making often had to happen quickly, sometimes based on incomplete or incorrect information, and there were moments when false alarms or technical errors created the illusion of an incoming attack, bringing the world dangerously close to escalation. And in such a fragile environment, the idea that additional chaos could be triggered from inside the country itself made the situation even more unpredictable, because it would have been almost impossible to immediately understand what was happening or where the threat was coming from. What makes all of this even more disturbing is not just what we know, but what we don't know, because even today, decades after the Cold War ended, parts of these operations remain classified, lost, or only partially understood. And that means the full scale of what was planned, prepared, or even partially executed may never be completely revealed. And history often shows us only fragments, leaving the rest hidden in archives, documents, or memories that may never surface. And when you look at all of this together, the agents, the hidden caches, the planned sabotage, the near misses and silent incidents, it becomes clear that the Cold War was not only a standoff between two distant powers, but also a hidden conflict that was already embedded inside everyday life. And the most unsettling question is not just how close the world came to disaster, but how much of it remained invisible, because if something like this could exist for decades without being fully exposed, then it forces you to think differently about what security really means, and whether the most dangerous threats are always the ones we can actually see. And even though the Cold War officially ended, the shadow it left behind never truly disappeared, because systems like these don't simply vanish overnight. They evolve, adapt, and in some cases remain hidden far beyond the moment they were created for. And that is what makes this story so unsettling even today, because we are not just talking about history, but about a way of thinking, a strategy that proved it was possible to build something so deeply embedded that it could exist unnoticed for years, even decades. And if it worked once, there is no guarantee that similar methods are not still being used in different forms, under different circumstances. The idea that entire networks of people could live normal lives while being part of something hidden challenges the way we understand reality itself, because it means that what we see on the surface is not always the full picture. And during the Cold War, both sides invested enormous resources into creating systems that could survive even the most extreme scenarios, including total breakdown of communication, leadership, and infrastructure. And that level of preparation suggests that the conflict was never seen as something limited or temporary, but as something that could reach a point where only the most deeply hidden elements would remain operational. At the same time, many of the technologies and methods developed during that era laid the foundation for what we see today, from surveillance systems to intelligence networks. And while the world has changed, the logic behind these strategies has not disappeared. because the concept of influencing, disrupting, or controlling a system from within remains just as powerful now as it was then. And in some ways even more so, because modern societies are more interconnected, more dependent on infrastructure, and more vulnerable to disruptions that may not even be immediately visible. But perhaps the most important part of this story is not just what happened, but what it reveals about how close things can come to the edge without anyone realizing it. Because throughout the Cold War there were countless moments that never made headlines, situations that were resolved quietly, decisions that were made in seconds, and risks that the public never fully understood. And when you combine that with the existence of hidden networks prepared to act from within, it becomes clear that the line between stability and chaos was much thinner than it seemed. And this leads to a final thought that stays with you long after the story ends. Because if a system like this could exist in the past, hidden in plain sight, operating silently within everyday life, then the real question is not just what we know about it now, but what we might still be missing. Because sometimes the most dangerous things are not the ones we can see, but the ones that have been there all along, waiting for a moment that, fortunately, never came.